just like, whoops. Okay, so Water Walk, it's very funny. He's invited to Milan to perform, and he does this first on Italian television and then on American TV back in New York. But it's a program in America called in Milan called Lascia o Raddoppia, which is like double or nothing, and it's a quiz show. And Cage goes on the show and he answers questions about mushrooms. And as some of you might know, he knows a lot about mushrooms, so he keeps lasting longer and longer on the show, and they keep inviting him back. And so he asks him if he can do his indeterminate scores on TV, and this creates a huge audience. Apparently Fellini wants to put him in a film, and it's unbelievable that the Italians loved him. So this was sort of 1959, and then so he does this water walk. It's like a 3-minute thing. He has to run around and do. He said, "I call it water walk because it's water and I'm walking." So he's walking around and he does all these things to do with water. Now, if you look at Fluxus scores, you'll see that they have vases of flowers and bathtubs and all these things. So I wouldn't say that necessarily that it's all one-way traffic, because Cage is teaching half these artists at exactly the same time at the new school. So maybe, and they're performing scores in class, even though Fluxus hasn't been invented. But it's very interesting who sort of inspired who at this moment, because Cage gets very theatrical. And I think part of the reason why he gets so theatrical is because he knows these kind of boring flat scores aren't going to make an impact unless he kind of enacts them and makes them physical. And I believe also that dance showed him how important the visual side of things were, and he knew that, like, he was always, as a composer, pushed to the side of the stage, and the dancers had the whole stage. So he sort of understood that the visual is a more powerful tool than just the purely musical. So he gets very theatrical when he's introducing the most difficult part of his work, which is this indeterminate structure. So, yeah, he's at the very same time as he's introducing indeterminacy, he's teaching his class at the new school. This is Jackson Maxwell, who's an extraordinary figure of concrete poetry, as well as an incredible political figure. He turns the score structure and the poetic structure into a sort of anarchist position, actually more strongly than Cage, and earlier than Cage became an anarchist. And then you have George Brecht here, Alan Capro, and Al Hansen. Now, for those of you who do or don't know, George Brecht invented a concept called the event, and Alan Capro invented the happening. They were both in Cage's class, and both those forms that they invented have to do with time, and bringing time into the work of art. So it's an incredible structure. This is actually Brecht's notebook from the first day of class, so you can see him, you can see exactly what was coming out of Cage's mouth on the first day of class. So he's dividing up the dimensions of sound into a field, right? And then, so it's a spatial model of sound. And then at the bottom, it says, at one time, Cage conceived of sound and silence as in opposition. But after the anechoic chamber experience, the high note being his nervous system and the low note being his blood circulating, he concluded that that silence was non-existent. So he stood up in class and said, I went to an anechoic chamber. And so it's sort of interesting that he's reciting that story again and again, and his students sort of pick up on this model of silence. Oh, sorry, I didn't identify. That's Dick Higgins. He becomes a Fluxus artist. And then up the top is George Brecht again. And we don't really know the guy on the left. So in the context of Cage's class, Brecht develops this model of the score. It's still called music now. Eventually he'll call it the event, right? But it's timetable music. And Alan Capro does this score. So they're doing experimental scores. Cage says, go home and give me a score for radios. And so they come back and they all come up with all these possibilities and they perform them in class. So Brecht did this one as a piece for homework, and what it was he told the whole class, okay, we have to leave the classroom, go out, and they went to Grand Central Station in Manhattan and performed this piece. So what they had to do was, it's called timetable music, they had to get a timetable at the train station and look up the time. So says, like if it says the train's leaving at 7:16, you make your event for 7 minutes and 16 seconds. So in that time you have to just sort of observe everything that goes on at the railway station. Noises, a child running past, all this sort of stuff, and that's your event. Okay? Alan Capro did a slightly more primitive one with a knife and a breadboard going ding, 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 and all this, but they're students, they're sort of testing the possibilities of sound. Alan Capro also said that he went to Cage's class because he was extending, you might know that he wrote a very famous essay called The Legacy of Jackson Pollock, and it was about how Pollock implied that the artwork is suddenly all around us, because Capro had seen Pollock's paintings very tight together in a gallery all around, and he sort of said, like, it's an environment. So Capro said, now we have to treat the whole world as a work of art. So he'd made these things called environments. Now we would call it installation art. And you could walk in. And then he said he wanted to add sound to those environments. So he went to ask Cage, how do you use magnetic tape? How can I add sound to my environment? And he ends up developing what we call a happening. So this is the kind of model of 433 that Cage writes after he's taught these students. There you have the three versions. So what you'll see in the exhibition is the sort of first wave of what we call post-Cagean scores. Lamont Young, who's a very important figure in this story, he wasn't in Cage's class, but he comes to New York in 1960, and he arranges a series of concerts at Yoko Ono's loft in New York, and all these people are performing scores. So Lamont Young does a series of scores called Compositions 1960, and they're going to be very important for Fluxus and for all these other models of performance. Although if you speak to Lamont Young and you call him Fluxus, he may kill you because he really hates the idea that he's Fluxus. So he develops this score model, and the most famous score he develops is called Draw a Straight Line and Follow It, which everyone picks up this one-line score. But the idea is that Lamont Young's into sound, so he does this thing called a drone, and he considers the idea, it's another spatial model of sound where he thinks you can get inside a sound if you hear it for long enough, right? So that's Lamont Young models. Brecht's model goes from timetable music to timetable event, and Henry Flint at the same time invents this idea of concept art. Why do I have these three examples up? Because it shows Cage's legacy in art, music, and in a conceptual sphere that is neither. So it's